Walked about his kingdom, turning everything he could into gold. At first, he was gleeful, thinking of all the riches and glory that would come his way. Midas started to daydream about his ambitious agenda to take his kingdom into the 21st century, and the New York Times profile a multi-million-dollar account on Insta that would follow. But when Midas returned to his castle, he was in for some surprises. He tried to have a meal, but everything that he ate turned to gold. This got him worried. And unbeknownst to him, his daughter came up behind him to give him a kiss. And before he could warn her, she kissed him and was also turned into gold. Midas realized that he'd made a grave mistake. His beloved had been turned into a rock. Despair filled his heart. This power he had sought with such a singular focus, Midas realized, was not a blessing, but a curse. Again, not a blessing, but a curse. So I think this ancient fable could not be more relevant for our day, because the new elite messaging we're getting online, in the media, in the academy about work and freedom and family is advancing a kind of Midas mindset. This mindset discounts the importance of marriage and family. Forging a meaningful and happy life, we're told, is to be found in a rewarding career, in money, in freedom from all of the encumbrances of family life. The message is mammon over marriage in much of our culture today. And this kind of came home for me one night as I was finishing up my book, Get Married, and there was a headline trending on Twitter, and this is in the sort of days before Elon Musk had taken control. I guess it's sort of the BEM days of Twitter. And the headline that was trending on Twitter that night as I was finishing up this book was this. It said that women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. Again, women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. Now, I want to be clear here, actually, the evidence actually is that financially, women who get married and stay married are doing a lot better. So this Bloomberg piece was kind of, off the mark on the financial dimension of this story. What was also kind of striking about this story in Bloomberg was that they kind of profiled one woman after another who was single and childless and kind of living her best life. Women like Ashley Marrero, who is pictured here in this Bloomberg story. She's a 43-year-old professional splitting time between high-end properties in Manhattan and the Jersey Shore, and she takes, quote, frequent travel for pleasure as well as work. So Bloomberg's message here was pretty clear. The recipe for a meaningful and happy life leads away from marriage and family and not towards it. Or in her words, quote, I love my life and feel very fulfilled. Again, I love my life without a spouse and kids, and feel very fulfilled. Okay. Now, lest you think this is kind of an outlier when it comes to the mainstream media, we have obviously stories like this in The Atlantic, making the case against marriage. We have one of my favorites in the New York Times from a writer in Brooklyn. They're always from Brooklyn, and she's saying, married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game no one wins. Okay? So again, from kind of like the left in a lot of the mainstream organs, there's an anti-nuptial and really an anti-natal message coming out. You kind of can see it right here in the New York Times. Okay, so I think for me, as a conservative Catholic, to be talking about the ways in which the left has been kind of dinging on marriage and family, probably not too surprising, particularly for an audience, like this one. But we're kind of now getting this message too from not just the left, but also from what's been called kind of the red pill right. Okay, people like Pearl Davis on the left here and Andrew Tate have been kind of articulating also a kind of anti-nuptial message, but not targeting women, like many on the left. They're now targeting men. Okay, they're kind of telling young men that marriage is not the path that they should be taking. And Andrew Tate, obviously, is one of the biggest online voices out there in the manosphere. And what's kind of striking about kind of the reach of his voice is that I was giving a talk on marriage and family to an LDS audience in Salt Lake City and had a question from a teenage Mormon boy asking me about, Andrew Tate's perspective. So kind of this kind of negative take that Tate offers here is reaching a lot of audiences, including, young teenage Mormon boys. And so what he is arguing, from his perspective is that there is, quote, zero statistical advantage when it comes to marriage for men. He says, if you use your mind, if you use your head instead of your heart, and look at the advantages to getting married, there are absolutely none. Okay, so he's convinced that men shouldn't invest in marriage because from his perspective, most marriages today end in divorce. So as a consequence, he thinks that any man in his right mind ought to stay single, get strong, make lots of money, play with his toys. Of course, Tate's partial to his Bugatti, and use, right, but not invest in the opposite sex. Okay? So we're kind of in a weird moment where now there are kind of both voices on the left and on the right who are basically encouraging young adults to kind of embrace the Midas mindset in somewhat different ways and steer clear of marriage and family life. So again, kind of the takeaway here that you're kind of getting is that the path to a meaningful and happy life runs away from the family and not towards it, okay? Away from the family and not towards it. And so I've seen this Midas mindset also kind of articulated by my students at the University of Virginia. Students like Holly, a recent graduate of UVA. Now don't get me wrong, my students are ambitious, they're hardworking, and they're polite. But again, I think this kind of more skeptical view about love and marriage and family has kind of gotten into their own, hearts and minds, and they've kind of bought into this idea that the real kind of path to a meaningful, happy life really runs more down this sort of Midas pathway. So Holly said to me this, she said, UVA students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their career started than getting into a serious relationship, she said. If it happens, great, but the focus is definitely on building our own brands first. The thought process is relationships and love are a risk, but you always have your career and success to fall back on, okay? At least while you're young. Okay, so clearly she's kind of taking this more career-focused mindset pretty hard. And she's by no means an outlier. Pew's been doing a lot of different polls, lately, showing that adults, that parents now, and also just recently teenagers are kind of much more likely to think that things like money and work are a more reliable path to a fulfilling life than things like getting married and having kids. So again, we're just kind of seeing a lot of polling evidence that's telling us that this Midas mindset has also kind of permeated the hearts and minds of many adults and, in this case, teenagers across the country. But I'm also a social scientist, and I want to know kind of what does the data tell us about kind of happiness in America, for instance, a pretty important outcome. And it is true that things like education, work, and money, as sort of the proponents of this Midas mindset might suspect, are associated with more happiness. But what they don't, I think, realize is that empirically, nothing compares. Again, nothing compares in the data to really a good marriage, especially in forging a meaningful and happy life, okay? So we see, for instance, just kind of looking at what's called the General Social Survey, the GSS. It's kind of a major social barometer from the University of Chicago that's done every 2 years with a couple thousand Americans across the country. And looking in that data, what we see here is that yes, getting a college degree at a school like Benedictine here on the left increases your odds of being very happy by about 64%. And having more money in yellow also boosts your happiness. And having a satisfying career here in red also increases your happiness, if you're an American. But just simply being married is a better predictor of being very happy in America than these other markers are than the kind of Midas mindset markers are. And there is nothing in our data that is as powerful in predicting happiness for women and men than a good marriage. That's the kind of green bar you're seeing on the far right. So it's not the case that like good health or sexual frequency or obviously money or even religious attendance is as predictive as having a good marriage is in this general social survey data. So again, what it's telling us is the odds of being very happy with your life increased by 545% for those in a good marriage. I also would kind of note here too, because this sort of came up in some earlier presentations in the last day and a half, that there's no group of women and men in America aged 18 to 55 who are happier on average than married mothers, contra that New York Times writer, and then married fathers, in a sense, contra kind of Andrew Tate. So kind of comparing them to married folks without kids, to single and childless, peers, and to single parents, again, the happiest group in America are married fathers and married mothers. So what's kind of going on here? Well, I think, if we turn to Aristotle, we're reminded that man is by nature a social animal. And so our ties with others, with friends and family members end up being crucial to our welfare, at least for most of us, right? They afford meaning, direction, and a sense of solidarity. So many opportunities both to receive care from others and then also, as importantly, to kind of give care towards others. And so it's these ties, these social ties, not the priorities associated with the Midas mindset, that end up being the most kind of conducive predictors of human happiness, but also, of course, of meaning too, as well. And so I think to kind of bring back this Midas idea also kind of into our thinking here tonight, I think in a sense the sort of broader Midas curse that we're sort of struggling with in our society today is that many of us are kind of having difficulties related to maybe not having kids or not kind of enjoying the American dream, in part because we're not connected to a family, and that affects our capacity to forge a meaningful and happy life today. Okay, and so what we're seeing, for instance, is dramatic declines in happiness across the U.S., and we'll see in a second kind of how that relates to, again, this sort of marriage issue. So in thinking about the relationship between the kind of triumph of a Midas mindset and the decline of a marriage mindset, I want to first just to think about a guy that I call Scott. And Scott lives in the outer suburbs of Washington, D.C. By the standards of success in today's culture, nothing should be bothering Scott, who is unmarried and childless, 34. He's got a college degree from Clemson, an engaging career as a military contractor, a house of his own, and a good-sized bank account, as he makes more than $100,000 a year from his job. But these educational and professional accomplishments, the Midas kinds of accomplishments, are not enough for Scott. He says, I've got degrees on my wall, I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end, is what he said to me. It's not like I can take any of that with me after I die. And Scott feels alone and at sea on many a day. Quote, I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize I'm alone. I have nobody. Okay? Now, what's clear in kind of talking to Scott is that he is struggling with a kind of toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. Okay? Again, his evenings during the work week and his weekends are pretty empty without a spouse and without kids to kind of share his life and to orient his life. Now, in saying this and kind of making the point about Scott, I want to be clear here. There are many, of course, single people out there who are living wonderful lives, and there are many married folks who are struggling. We all know that to be the case. But thinking about this in a kind of broader sociological way, that can kind of connect his story to some bigger trends that are, I think, pretty troubling today. And so I talk about in my book, for instance, this idea there's kind of a closing of the American heart unfolding across our land, where there is less dating, there's less love, there's less marriage, and there is less family formation, less childbearing. One example of this is that the marriage rate here has come down more than 60% since 1970. Now, this kind of abstract statistic can seem kind of, vague. Like, what does that mean in real terms? Well, what it means in real terms is that in my big class at UVA, I have 1 in 3 of my students stand up at this moment in time. And then I tell them this. I tell them that 1 in 3 young adults today, like in their early 20s, will never marry, okay? And we've never been at a moment in our culture where so many young adults are projected to never put a ring on it, to never become husbands or wives, in today's culture. And obviously there are many ways in which this kind of trend is significant for America, for our country, for our nation. But again, when we think again about this question of kind of human happiness as kind of one important outcome, and we are, of course, a nation that's dedicated in part to the pursuit of happiness, as my founder, Thomas Jefferson, wrote many, many years ago. And then we see in some recent work by the Chicago economist, Sam Peltzman, that in his analyses of declines in happiness in the United States, the number one factor that he found kind of driving this story, driving this trend, was the fact that fewer and fewer Americans have been able to or want to, in a sense, put a ring on it, right? So he says, quote, "The recent decline in the married share of adults can explain statistically most of the recent decline in overall happiness." So again, more and more Americans are experiencing difficulty in that classic American pursuit, the pursuit of happiness. And it looks like, the sort of eclipse of a marriage mindset in favor of a Midas mindset, or to speak more broadly, this kind of closing of the American heart is very much, a big part of the explanation for declines in American happiness. Okay, so this is the bad news tonight, okay, the bad news. But we're also, I think, as a community, kind of looking for some good news. Looking for kind of Easter to be here in a few weeks, right? And so the good news tonight is that there are some Americans today across this country who are succeeding at forging strong and stable marriages, okay? So some Americans are succeeding at forging strong and stable marriages. And I talk about 4 different groups who are kind of masters of marriage in America today, who are more likely to be succeeding when it comes to, again, forging strong and stable marriages. I talk about Asian Americans in my book. I talk about conservative Americans in my book. I talk about the faithful, that's religious Americans in the book, and then also strivers or college-educated Americans. And they have somewhat kind of different stories, obviously, and some of them are obviously overlapping. I spoke to a man in Northern Virginia, for instance, who was an Indian American, a conservative, a convert to Christianity, and college-educated. And so he would be like super happy and super stably married. And of course, actually, he was both those two things, right? But you can kind of find in the data that each of these kind of groups kind of stands out statistically when it comes to typically forging, married homes that are either happily married or stably married or both, okay? And then as a consequence of this, pattern, they're also more likely to report that they're kind of living meaningful and happy lives as well, okay? And I'll come back to that as I conclude a little bit later on. But what's their secret? How are they managing to forge strong and stable marriages in 21st century America? And part of the story for a number of these groups is that they are doing what I kind of recommend in my subtitle, which is to defy the elites, okay? Defy the elites. And when the subtitle came out, just as a side note, Matt Iglesias sort of snidely was saying, well, isn't it true that the elites are the ones who are succeeding at marriage in America today? So why, Wilcox, are you saying defy the elites? And what I don't think Matt understood, was that many of our elites are actually kind of talking left and walking right. So they're sort of projecting and kind of parroting and talking about ideas that would kind of push us in a leftward direction when it comes to family. We kind of look at the sort of particulars of their own marriages and their own family situations. You often find that they're, in many important ways, kind of living more traditional family-centered lives. And so what I'm talking about when it comes to defying elites is sort of defying a lot of the ideas and memes and norms and ideals that our elites have been propagating from the heights of the culture in recent decades. And in particular, I'll just mention 3 points tonight about kind of the cultural story. And I've got 5 in the book, but I don't want to keep you here all night. So I'll just talk about the importance of 3 C's in my book: communion, commitment, and community. And the way in which kind of embracing these 3 C's in a kind of manner that defies a lot of our elite culture is really helpful in forging a strong and stable marriage today. Okay, so the first C is communion. Communion, okay? When it comes to communion, I think we have to sort of think about defying the me-first mentality of our elites, okay? So again, I think too often today our elites stress a kind of me-first approach to marriage that privileges autonomy and freedom and self-interest, even in the context of love and marriage, okay? So I think you kind of can take a me-first approach to marriage and still do pretty well for yourself. One example of this relates to sort of how we handle money, okay? And I can't tell you how many journalists and how many financial professionals, including the guru here, Susie Orman, a big financial guru, kind of are urging couples today to have kind of his money and her money. So kind of me-first approach again to money, where you both kind of control your own money and don't necessarily have to kind of work together as a couple to manage your money together. So this is kind of like, her advice in part, is it's important to have, at least some, big, nest egg of your own to kind of control, particularly since, things might go south in your marriage. But as I talk to ordinary couples across the US, I had the sense that couples who kind of took a different approach to money were more likely to be flourishing. I'm thinking here, for instance, of John and Maria Erickson. When this Catholic couple were in the 82nd Airborne together and had gotten engaged, they were getting ready to deploy to Iraq. And so Maria headed to the store to get some items for both of them, and her list included some expensive items like ballistic glasses. They were really expensive, she told me, something like $160. So when she brought these items back to John, she made it clear to him that she expected to be paid back. And in her family of origin, her parents actually had kept separate accounts, kind of kept their money separate. But when she came back, John just kissed her on the forehead and said to her, "What is yours is mine, and mine is yours, and now we're going to be married. It's all going to be equal," okay? And this was kind of the first experience for her of kind of thinking about pooling her money. It was a little bit hard for her at first to do this, but they did get married, and they did pool their money, and she actually benefited pretty quickly from this because she brought a lot of debt from her graduate education as a lawyer into their marriage, and John, who was more fiscally kind of conservative, had brought no debt, into their marriage. And so as they were combining their Army salaries at the beginning of their family life, they were able to quickly retire her debt. And they've since gone on to kind of enjoy a marriage that's gone on more than 25 years, got a couple of kids, and they've navigated a lot of deployments and military challenges successfully. But again, their approach to money was emblematic of a kind of more team-based approach to married life, a more we-first approach to money and, again, to married life. And they're by no means outliers. What we see in the data that I collected with YouGov, thousands of husbands and wives across the US, is the couples who were pooling their money in the lighter bar, here in these 2 sections, were happier in their marriages and more likely to say that divorce was not at all likely for them. We even have really good new evidence, too, from Indiana, where they randomly assigned newlywed couples to 3 conditions. The first was separate accounts, the second was do as you please, and the third was assigning them to joint accounts. And in this kind of randomly assigned experiment in Indiana, the couples over the first 2 years of marriage who were randomly assigned to shared accounts did markedly better in their marriages in the first year. So kind of just more evidence that couples who are taking a we before me approach to marriage that's predicated on a sense of unity, teamwork, and service are much more likely to be flourishing today in their marriages. Okay, so again, this is kind of the communion point that I articulate in the book. The second C is about commitment. Commitment, okay? And again, I think on the commitment score, there's just so many ways in which our elites are discouraging us from embracing various norms that we associate, in our tradition with commitment, okay? Our elites are kind of discounting, not only values of sort of marital permanence, they've been doing that for a while, obviously, but also now kind of sexual fidelity. And what would you say is the most recent expression of this last point up on the screen here? Where have you seen kind of elite messaging kind of discouraging kind of the classic fidelity norm that we would embrace? I want to guess what I'm getting at here. What have you seen in the press in the last year or so? At least since the spring of 2024. What's been the new kind of fashion? Yeah, so open marriages. So polyamory is kind of the newest thing, right? And we've gotten pieces in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and New York Magazine. There's a new series on Peacock called From Couple to Thruple, would be kind of just another example of this. So, of course, I think the most kind of like evocative piece here was, again, in the New York Times. And of course, we have yet another writer from which part of New York, might you guess? From Brooklyn, yes. Something in the water in Brooklyn. I don't know what the problem is there, okay? But this is Molly Winter, a writer in Brooklyn. And the article in the New York Times about her new book, More, was, quote, how a polyamorous mom had a big sexual adventure and found herself. I mean, you just can't, it's just beyond parody, this stuff, right? But again, the idea here is that it's important to kind of keep all our options open, to maximize our choices and not to have to lock into one person in a long-term relationship, right? That's kind of the message we're getting here. It's all about kind of choice, 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 choice. But again, as I talked to ordinary couples across the US, had the sense that couples who took kind of a rather different approach were more likely to be flourishing. Thinking here of a guy called Patrick in Virginia. He's actually not conservative, not religious, but he's a family-oriented guy. He's tall, he's handsome, he's well-spoken, he's a redhead, he travels a lot for his work, he also plays a guitar in a band on the side. I mean, he's the kind of guy and has the kind of life that might, I think, make him vulnerable for infidelity. But Patrick is intentional. He's intentional about protecting his marriage in real life. He says, quote, when I'm meeting new people in my line of work, I talk a lot about my wife and kids. I want them to know I'm a family man, is what he said to me. He also has rules governing his online interactions. Quote, my wife is tagged in a majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person. I do not follow old girlfriends, as there's a reason that they're in that category, okay? So he's careful, right, both in the real world and in the virtual world. It's probably no accident that his wife, Kelly, gives their marriage a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is, the best score for her marriage with Patrick. Again, there's a measure of security in part in this relationship that she enjoys. And what we see in the data, in the GSS again actually here, is that Americans who kind of take the classic view on the bottom here, that any kind of sex outside of marriage, one's marriage, is, quote, always wrong, are happier than, unfortunately, the growing number of Americans who take the more progressive, the newer view that that's not always wrong. And of course, those folks who take this kind of progressive view in red are less likely to be happily married. So again, the point here is that this newer, more progressive approach to marriage is less committed and less likely to be connected to reports of higher marital quality. And we see in the research more generally that when you kind of look at different predictors of marital quality, you often find that some kind of measure of commitment is the number one factor here. So again, it's important to defy the elites when it comes to sort of how we think about commitment and to embrace a kind of more classic view about the importance of things like marital permanence, till death do us part, and the importance of fidelity, of forswearing all others once we put a ring on it. Okay, so that's the second C, commitment. What about the third C here? I'm thinking about community. Community. So when it comes to community, I think increasingly the elite view, this is a point that's made by Aaron Renn, a prominent new kind of conservative Protestant public intellectual, sort of arguing we're living in kind of a negative world today in America when we're kind of Christians. His point is that there was a time, in America when there was kind of like a positive association with being a Christian. And then we kind of moved to a neutral world, and now it's a negative world where being a Christian is often kind of seen to be a bad thing, particularly by elites. And so the thought here is that elites often would say that one kind of community, a religious community, is an obstacle to progress, to kind of living your best life and realizing your best love. Again, it's an obstacle to progress, to living your best life and realizing your best love. And this kind of came out to me in kind of reading this very long interview in the New Yorker with a sociologist named Sam Perry. And the article, about this whole interview was titled this: A Sociologist of Religion on Protestants, Porn, and the Purity Industrial Complex. And you kind of can imagine how this interview went. But basically, Professor Perry was sort of suggesting that Christian men were afflicted by guilt and shame, if they looked at pornography, and that their evangelical Christian wives were upset with them if they looked at pornography, and they were more likely to divorce them. So you kind of had this sense that they were kind of like this benighted group, kind of stuck in an antiquarian view of sexuality, and this is all kind of very dysfunctional. It's kind of like, I think, that the takeaway. That again, kind of taking a more traditional and more religious view of sex was just kind of out of touch and not helpful in kind of living your best life, right, and realizing your best love. That if you wanted to be kind of happily married, you got to kind of get with the times and put aside all these antiquarian religious ideas about things like sex, okay? But again, when I spoke to ordinary couples across the U.S., didn't quite get this story playing out with ordinary couples. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a couple that I call Martin and Kimberly, living in the Maryland suburbs of D.C., African-American evangelical Christians. So for instance, Martin said to me, like when he's on the internet, checking out his favorite news and music, he's kind of careful. He says, it's one of those things where, the Bible's very clear about fleeing temptation, he said to me, adding, quote, so yeah, certain sites I won't go on. He also talked to me about how he talks regularly with his pastor about how he's doing as a husband and father, how his pastor kind of is challenging him to kind of raise the bar as a husband and father, and that's helpful. That's a helpful kind of spur to him to be a good family man. And when I spoke to Kimberly, she had a pretty poignant story kind of mentioning that she had been sexually abused as a child by a family member. And this had made her marriage initially challenging in the intimacy department. She said, but that's how prayer entered, because I had some stuff happen prior to us that made having sex challenging for me. And I'm like, okay, God, you're only going to heal me. Only God can really truly heal this. So both through the power of prayer and through the kind of advice and counsel of some friends in her church, able to kind of navigate this situation and go on to forge, a strong marriage, both kind of, physically and emotionally with Martin. So again, kind of the story that I got from them was that faith was helping them forge a strong marriage and family life. It wasn't an obstacle. And their story is emblematic of kind of the bigger empirical story that I see in my book, In Get Married, which is that couples who share a common faith are significantly happier in their marriages than couples who don't go to church together. For instance, as this figure here tells us, they're about 15 percentage points more likely to be very happy in our YouGov survey if they're attending church together compared to their peers who don't attend church at all. Okay, so again, more faith, more happiness in marriage is kind of the story. And then when it comes to divorce, what we see here is that, in this case, looking at Tyler Vanderbilt's work at Harvard, women who are regularly attending church are almost 50% less likely to get divorced than their female peers who don't go to church. Okay, so it's just one example of kind of the broader research kind of underlining a connection between more faith and less divorce. Okay, again, not the kind of takeaway you have gotten from the New Yorker, right? Kind of suggesting that those evangelicals, were more likely to land in divorce court. Not true, actually, at all. But what about religion and sex? What's the story there? Because again, you kind of got this sense from the New Yorker that there's kind of like this very kind of negative relationship between religion and physical intimacy. Well, surprise, surprise, what we see actually is that when it comes to real sex, at least, there is now a divide between religious couples and secular couples. And it's not the kind of divide that I think our pop culture might expect us to find in the data, because what we're seeing now in America, and this is all new actually. So if you go back to 2000, there is no gap in sexual frequency between religious couples and secular couples. Okay, so again, in 2000, about 25 years ago, no gap. But today there is a gap, and about 2/3 of religious couples have sex at least once a week, compared to less than half of secular couples. And this bottom finding right here was, for me, the most surprising finding in my adult analyses for my book. I've got a different finding for kids that was surprising, but this was the most surprising finding that I had. And I think we could talk about this in the Q&A, but I think there's a lot that's going on here, but I think one possibility here is that, and a point that's overlooked actually by the New Yorker, is that if religious couples are less likely to become enmeshed in pornography, which is true, and maybe more likely too to kind of just steer clear of what I call electronic opiates, that could be a factor in fostering greater intimacy, for them. But again, this is kind of surprising, I think, given what the New Yorker says and kind of given what our pop culture might lead us to, I think, believe. And then not surprising, we see too that religious couples report that they're more likely to be sexually satisfied. Now, as I quickly kind of summarize the community point, I'm obviously focusing here on religion as kind of an expression of community. I want to make 2 points here about kind of religion and marriage. The first point is just to acknowledge, if we go back here to this slide, that the top bar also kind of tells us, right, that on any given Sunday, about 20% of wives and about 16% of husbands, this is a cross-sectional survey, are not in that very happy category, right? So in other words, there's a minority of folks in church on any given Sunday, who are not flourishing. And I want to acknowledge that, again, that like religion's not some kind of like magic pill, that you take and everything all goes perfectly. I mean, I've been married 29 years, and there have been days, weeks, months when we've had our tough times in our marriage, right? So I want to acknowledge again that religion's not some magic pill. But the second point that I want to make here, as we kind of wrap up the religion point, is just that birds of a feather flock together. Birds of a feather flock together. You can tell a lot about a person by looking at their 5 closest friends. You are your friends, right? And if your friends are kind of doing good things with you and for you, and often, like in this case, in a church context, generally speaking, they're going to kind of encourage you to be a better husband, better wife, better father, better mother, help you when you're suffering, and reproach you when you're failing in some important way, right? So the family first values, virtues, and social networks that we find oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes in religious communities, typically strengthen and stabilize marriage because, again, we are our friends, birds of a feather flock together. So again, this is kind of the point about community, that certain kinds of communities are more likely to foster strong and stable marriages in America today. And again, I began kind of talking about this issue of happiness in tonight's talk. And as I conclude here, I just want to kind of mention here that in looking at, among other groups, religious Americans in general, in what's called, again, the General Social Survey, kind of the gold standard for polling on social issues and patterns in America, what I found in looking at happiness was that religious Americans were markedly more likely to be in the very happy category here on the left. And that secular Americans, who were not at all religious, no practice basically, were in the lowest category in the GSS, which is being, quote, not too happy. You can see that here on the right. Pretty happy is the middle category. It's not visualized up here. But again, the point here is that religious Americans today are markedly happier than secular Americans. And tonight's story is a big part of why this is the case, because when you look at the empirical factors that help to explain this happiness premium for religious Americans, what you find is that both marital status and marital happiness combined account for about a third of this happiness premium. So again, one big reason that religious Americans are happier, they're more likely to be kind of succeeding in that classic American pursuit, the pursuit of happiness, is because they're more likely to be embedded in the context of a good marriage and family life. So again, the bigger point here is that the path for many masters of marriage, be they Asian American or religious Americans or conservative Americans or college-educated Americans, is the path to a meaningful and happy life runs through marriage and family, and not as Bloomberg would have us believe, or Andrew Tate would have us believe, or some writer from Brooklyn would have us believe, away from marriage and family, right? That's what we're sort of seeing in the data. And so to conclude, tonight's bad news, obviously, is that marriage in America is in retreat. There's a kind of closing of the American heart unfolding among too many adults across the country. And I would say that's in part because too many of our elites, and now too many Americans, have embraced a kind of Midas mindset. They're under the misimpression that life is about money, work, and me, me, me. They've put mammon before marriage. And this is a big mistake, as we've seen, because nothing supplies the kind of meaning, direction, and solidarity, kind of in this world at least, that marriage and family tend to do. So the challenge then, I think, for us is that we must be fostering a marriage mindset for the 21st century in our schools, in our colleges, on social media, in our churches, and in our homes. And this is why the work that Benedictine is doing to educate the next generation about the culture of life and the centrality of marriage and family is so important. Your classes, this symposium, and the Center for Family Life here at Benedictine are witnessing to that which matters most, which of course is not mammon, but love. So thank you.